Chapter 1: The Early Years. Forrest Gump was born in the small town of Greenbow, Alabama, in 1944, into a world that wasn't always kind to him. From the start, life seemed determined to test him in ways few could understand. His mind wasn't like other children's, and his physical challenges set him apart. But his mother, a resilient woman with a heart full of love, was determined to make sure Forrest had every chance to succeed. She often told him, "Life is like a box of chocolates, Forrest. You never know what you're gonna get," a phrase that would become as much a part of Forrest's life as the air he breathed. As a boy, Forrest had a pronounced limp and struggled with his ability to learn. His classmates teased him, calling him names that made him feel like an outsider. But no matter how cruel the world around him was, his mother never let him forget that he was capable of greatness. She taught him that even though he wasn't like the other kids, he could still do things that mattered. In her eyes, Forrest was no different than anyone else, and she made sure he knew it. "You're special, Forrest. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise," she often said. His mother's love and determination helped him navigate the difficulties of school. While the other children learned with ease, Forrest had to work harder. His teacher, Mrs. Gibbons, noticed his struggle early on, but she also saw the spark in his eyes and the eagerness to learn. She encouraged him, not to fit into the traditional mold, but to find his own way. Despite the teasing, Forrest found solace in the simple things. One of his earliest memories was running with the wind, feeling the freedom in his legs as he escaped the jeers of his classmates. His mother encouraged this passion, taking him to see the doctor for his braces, which would help him run better. Though the braces were awkward and uncomfortable at first, they eventually helped Forrest break free from the limitations he once felt. In those early years, life for Forrest wasn't easy, but it was filled with the steady, unshakable love of his mother and a sense of purpose that would follow him throughout his life. Greenbow may have been a small town, but it was the foundation of Forrest's journey, a journey that would take him farther than anyone could have imagined. The early years of Forrest's life weren't marked by extraordinary events, but by the quiet, steady determination of a boy who was told, time and time again, that he wasn't like the others. And through the love of his mother, he came to believe that being different wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was what made him uniquely him. This was the beginning of Forrest Gump's extraordinary life, a life that would take him to places he could never have imagined and through experiences that defied all odds. But it all started with a simple lesson from a mother who believed in him, no matter what the world said. Chapter 2: Overcoming Adversity. Forrest Gump's childhood wasn't marked by the usual milestones that most children experience. While others ran with ease and learned in the classrooms, Forrest was forced to work harder at every step. But it was through these challenges that he began to develop the resilience that would carry him through the rest of his life. When Forrest entered school, he was faced with what felt like an insurmountable mountain. His legs were weak, and his mind didn't grasp concepts the way others did. But his mother, ever the determined force in his life, had already prepared him for the world's cruelty. She told him, "You may not be the smartest, but you have a good heart. And that's more important than anything." At school, Forrest faced a constant barrage of taunts and teasing. His classmates were quick to remind him that he wasn't normal. The taunts were particularly hurtful, but they didn't break him. Instead, they motivated him to push forward, proving to himself that he was capable of more than anyone expected. With his mother's encouragement, Forrest learned to take pride in his achievements, no matter how small they seemed to others. It was the physical challenges that first made Forrest stand out. His braces, which were designed to help him walk better, only drew more attention from the other children. They laughed at him, calling him cripple and other cruel names. But his mother, always by his side, reminded him, "You just have to run, Forrest. Run like the wind." And so, Forrest ran. He ran whenever he could, whether it was on the dirt road outside his house or in the fields around Greenbow. The world didn't make it easy for him, but when he ran, he felt free from the limitations his body imposed on him, and free from the cruel words of others. One fateful day, as he was being chased by a group of bullies, something incredible happened. He took off running, faster than anyone could have anticipated. With each step, his braces came off, and he realized that he could run without them. It wasn't just the braces that fell away. Forrest was letting go of the limitations that others had placed on him. It was his first taste of true freedom. His newfound ability to run didn't just change how he felt about himself, it also opened doors for him. He became the star of the school's track team, running faster than anyone had ever seen before. His speed became a source of pride, not just for him, but for his school. He was no longer the boy who struggled, he was the boy who could outrun anyone. But Forrest's journey wasn't just about physical challenges. It was about the mental and emotional obstacles he would continue to face as he grew older. In school, he struggled to learn the same way his classmates did. His teachers did their best to help, but nothing seemed to stick. Yet Forrest never gave up. Instead of focusing on what he couldn't do, he honed in on what he could. He wasn't a great student in the traditional sense, but he had a deep, unshakable loyalty, and he always did his best. One of the most difficult moments of Forrest's childhood came when he realized that he wasn't like the other children in more ways than one. He loved Jenny, the girl who had been his friend since childhood. But Jenny's life was full of pain, a pain that Forrest couldn't understand. Jenny's behavior, her rebellious nature, seemed so foreign to him. She ran from things that Forrest would face head-on. Their worlds were different, but Forrest's heart was unwavering in its love for her. As the years passed, Forrest's resilience grew stronger. The bullying subsided, and his physical abilities took him farther than anyone could have predicted. He wasn't just the boy who couldn't walk without help or the one who was teased. He was the boy who overcame every challenge in his path. Forrest learned that life wouldn't always be fair, and it wouldn't always be easy. But through his determination, and with the constant support of his mother, he began to believe that anything was possible. And though others may have doubted him, Forrest knew one thing for sure: he would never give up. The adversity he faced shaped him into a person who would go on to face the hardest challenges life could throw at him. But through every setback, Forrest learned the simple truth that has carried him through life. No matter how hard life may seem, it's the will to keep moving forward that makes all the difference. And so, Forrest Gump ran, not just to escape the taunts of the past, but toward the incredible journey that lay ahead. Chapter 3: The Vietnam War. In the spring of 1966, Forrest Gump found himself standing at the gates of a new chapter in his life. Though still just a young man, with a childlike sense of wonder and an unshakable optimism, the world was changing fast, and Forrest was about to be swept up in the tide of history. The Vietnam War was raging, and for Forrest, it would become a defining moment that tested his character, his courage, and his understanding of the world. It was his mother's belief in him that kept him grounded. "You're special, Forrest. I know you'll make a difference," she told him as he prepared to leave for the military. Though Forrest wasn't entirely sure why he was going, he knew it was something he had to do, and his sense of duty was something that always guided him. The army, as it turned out, was where he would truly find his place. Forrest didn't enter the army like most young men his age. He wasn't a fighter, nor was he particularly motivated by the ideas of patriotism or glory. He simply went because that's what he was told to do. But he would soon discover that the war in Vietnam would demand far more of him than he could have ever imagined. His time in boot camp was an experience of physical and mental challenge. Despite his previous hardships, Forrest wasn't prepared for the rigorous training. Yet, as always, he did his best. Unlike most of the other recruits, he wasn't interested in impressing anyone or showing off. He simply followed orders and focused on what was in front of him. His ability to endure, to push through the pain and exhaustion, set him apart. His drill sergeant, who initially saw Forrest as a liability, quickly realized that he was an exceptional soldier, not because he was the smartest or the strongest, but because he followed orders without hesitation and didn't question anything. In a world of chaos, Forrest's ability to remain calm and focused was a rare and invaluable trait. The day Forrest and his fellow soldiers were shipped out to Vietnam was one of uncertainty. The war was already well underway, and the country was divided on the reasons for fighting. But for Forrest, there was little confusion. He was simply going to do his job, whatever it might be. He hadn't asked for this, but he had no intention of backing down. In Vietnam, Forrest was assigned to a unit with a colorful cast of characters, but none stood out more than Lieutenant Dan Taylor and Bubba Blue. Lieutenant Dan was a soldier with a fierce sense of pride and an even fiercer temper. His family had a long history of military service, and he saw the war as a personal duty to uphold that tradition. He was a man of high expectations, and he quickly took notice of Forrest's unique ability to remain unshaken by the chaos around him. Bubba, on the other hand, was a kind and gentle soul from B1-B2, Alabama. He was the one person who understood Forrest's heart. The two bonded instantly over their shared southern roots, and Bubba made Forrest promise that he would start a shrimping business in his honor if they ever made it out of the war alive. The war in Vietnam was a nightmare of danger, confusion, and constant loss. Forrest's unit was deployed into some of the most hostile regions, where every day brought new threats and unseen dangers. The sounds of gunfire, the smell of smoke, and the ever-present fear were constant companions. Yet, through it all, Forrest seemed to move through the chaos without fully comprehending the gravity of the situation. It wasn't that he was numb to the horrors, rather, he simply wasn't capable of the same kind of fear that paralyzed the others. Forrest's world was one of action, and when something needed to be done, he did it. He followed orders, he helped his fellow soldiers, and he kept going. One fateful day, while on a mission, Forrest's platoon found themselves ambushed. The scene was as brutal as anything Forrest had ever seen. Men were dying all around him, and the fear was palpable. But amidst the chaos, Forrest's instinct took over. When the situation grew dire, he didn't think twice. He ran into the gunfire to save his comrades, picking up soldiers and carrying them to safety one by one. It was a simple, straightforward task in his mind: do what needed to be done. In the midst of the bloodshed, Forrest saved the lives of several men, including Lieutenant Dan, who had been severely wounded. After the ambush, Forrest's heroism became well known. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions that day, but he never fully understood the significance. To Forrest, it was just another day of doing what he was told. He didn't care about medals or recognition, he cared only for the people he had helped. It was this humility, this ability to see beyond the superficial, that made Forrest a hero in the eyes of others, even if he didn't see it himself. But the war would leave its scars. Bubba, the one man Forrest had truly connected with, was killed in combat. The loss of Bubba was something Forrest would carry with him for the rest of his life. The grief of losing a friend, combined with the lingering effects of the war, weighed heavily on Forrest's heart. And then there was Lieutenant Dan. After the ambush, Lieutenant Dan lost both of his legs and became a broken man. He blamed Forrest for saving him, convinced that he had been meant to die in battle, like the rest of his ancestors. Lieutenant Dan's anger and bitterness would become a constant source of tension between him and Forrest. Yet, through it all, Forrest remained steadfast in his friendship, never fully understanding the pain that drove Lieutenant Dan to lash out. The Vietnam War, with all its chaos and loss, marked a turning point in Forrest's life. He returned home a hero in the eyes of the public. But to Forrest, the war was just another chapter in a life filled with challenges and losses. Yet, through everything, the chaos, the violence, the pain, Forrest emerged from it with the same simple clarity that had always guided him. He had done his best. He had followed orders. And, in the end, that was all that mattered. Chapter 4: Life After War. Forrest Gump came home from Vietnam a hero, but he didn't feel like one. Medals and ceremonies didn't make sense to him. He had done what he was told, saved who he could, and lost people he cared about. That was war. That was life. But the world outside the battlefield was different now. People looked at him with admiration, but he didn't understand why. To him, he was just Forrest, the same boy from Greenbow, Alabama. After receiving the Medal of Honor from President Lyndon B. Johnson, Forrest found himself in the middle of a world he barely recognized. The country was divided. People protested the war he had fought in, calling soldiers like him killers and pawns. Forrest didn't understand politics or protests. He only knew that he had done his job. He didn't dwell on the reasons behind the war or the anger surrounding it. He simply kept moving forward, the way he always had. One of the few people Forrest still had in his life was Lieutenant Dan. But Dan wasn't the same man Forrest had known in Vietnam. After losing his legs, he was filled with anger and resentment. He believed he should have died in battle, like the generations of his family before him. Instead, he was stuck in a world he no longer felt a part of. He drifted into a life of drinking, self-pity, and pushing people away, including Forrest. But Forrest never gave up on people. He wasn't capable of understanding bitterness the way others did. He just knew that Dan was his friend, and he wasn't going to leave him behind. In the middle of all this, Forrest stumbled into something unexpected: ping pong. While recovering from his war wounds, he discovered the game and, as with running, he excelled at it. It didn't require deep thinking, just quick hands and focus, both of which Forrest had plenty of. Soon, the Army noticed his skill and sent him to play for the U.S. national team. Before he knew it, he was traveling to China as part of a diplomatic effort, what people would later call ping-pong diplomacy. Forrest didn't understand the politics of it, but he enjoyed playing. He played because it was fun, because it was something he was good at, and because it made people happy. When he returned home, Forrest's life took yet another turn. He was offered money to endorse a ping-pong paddle, and though he never cared much for money, he accepted. With his earnings, he did what he had promised his best friend Bubba: he bought a shrimp boat. Bubba's dream had always been to start a shrimping business, and even though Bubba was gone, Forrest wasn't going to let that dream die. He moved to Bayou La Beach, Alabama, bought a boat, and started shrimping. It wasn't easy. At first, he barely caught anything. The work was exhausting, the sea unpredictable. But Forrest never gave up. He worked day and night, following through on his promise. And then, just as things seemed hopeless, a storm came. A massive hurricane swept through the Gulf, destroying every shrimping boat in the area, except Forrest's. By sheer luck or fate, his boat, Jenny, was the only one left standing. With no competition left, the business took off, and suddenly, Forrest was making more money than he knew what to do with. That's when Lieutenant Dan showed up. Dan, despite all his anger, had been watching Forrest from a distance. Something about Forrest's unwavering loyalty, his refusal to give up, had struck a chord with him. He joined Forrest in the shrimp business, managing the finances while Forrest did the work. For the first time in years, Dan had a purpose again. He even learned to let go of some of his bitterness, even thanking Forrest for saving his life, something Forrest never fully understood, but appreciated nonetheless. Forrest and Dan ran the B1-B2 Shrimp Company together, and soon they were wealthy beyond anything Forrest could have imagined. But money never meant much to Forrest. So, he did what felt right. He gave a lot of it away. He donated to Bubba's family, built a church, and even helped his old friend's struggling community. Yet, despite all his success, Forrest's heart was still missing something. Jenny. She had been in and out of his life for years, drifting from place to place, always running from something. Drugs, protests, bad relationships. Jenny had seen the darkest parts of the world, while Forrest had moved through life with an almost childlike simplicity. Every time she left, he waited for her to come back. And every time she returned, he welcomed her with open arms, never asking why she had left in the first place. One day, out of nowhere, Jenny showed up again. This time, she stayed. For a while, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. They spent time together, walking through Greenbow, talking about the past. Forrest loved her, and he always had. And for a brief moment, it seemed like she might stay forever. Then, just as suddenly as she had come, Jenny left again. Forrest didn't question it. He never asked why people did the things they did. He simply accepted it, feeling the ache of loss but continuing forward, as he always had. Life after war had brought Forrest many things: fame, wealth, even a sense of purpose. But what he wanted most was something he couldn't buy or earn. He just wanted Jenny. And so, Forrest kept waiting. Chapter 5: Love and Loss. Forrest Gump had always loved Jenny Curran. From the moment they met as children, when she told him to sit beside her on the school bus, she had been the center of his world. No matter how many times she left, no matter how far she ran, Forrest never stopped loving her. He never questioned it. He just knew that Jenny was the most special person in his life. After years of drifting, Jenny had come back to Greenbow, Alabama. This time, she stayed for a while. Forrest didn't ask why she had returned, and Jenny didn't offer an explanation. They just existed together, walking through town, sitting on the porch, watching the world go by. To Forrest, it felt like the happiest time of his life. Jenny was there, and that was all that mattered. One night, Forrest finally told her what he had always felt. "I love you, Jenny," he said simply. Jenny smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "You don't know what love is, Forrest," she said softly. But Forrest did know. He might not have understood love the way other people did, but he knew that his heart belonged to her. He knew that every time she left, it hurt. He knew that when she was close, the world felt right. For a brief, fleeting moment, Jenny seemed to let down her guard. She stayed with Forrest, and they spent the night together. In that moment, Forrest felt like everything had finally come together. He believed that Jenny was home for good. But by morning, she was gone. She left without a word, without an explanation. Forrest woke up to an empty house, just like so many times before. He didn't understand why Jenny always ran, but he didn't chase after her. He never had. Instead, he did what he always did. He kept going. The days passed, then weeks, then months. Forrest poured himself into his routines, running, tending to the house, spending time with his mother. But then, another loss struck. His mother, the one person who had always believed in him, grew sick. It happened quickly, and before Forrest could fully understand what was happening, she was gone. Forrest sat by her bedside as she spoke her final words. "Life is like a box of chocolates, Forrest. You never know what you're gonna get." He didn't know how to live without her. His mother had always been his guiding light, the person who made sense of the world when he couldn't. But now, she was gone, just like Jenny. Forrest had always accepted life as it came, never questioning too much, never dwelling on the things he couldn't change. But this was different. This was a pain he couldn't outrun. For the first time in his life, Forrest didn't know what to do. So, he did the only thing that had ever made sense. He started running. He ran to escape the pain, to clear his mind, to find something, though he didn't know what. He ran across Alabama, then across the country. People started noticing him, following him, seeing something in him that he didn't see in himself. To them, he was a symbol of something, determination, hope, maybe even wisdom. To Forrest, he was just a man running, putting one foot in front of the other because he didn't know what else to do. Then, one day, just as suddenly as he had started, he stopped. He had run enough. It was time to go home. And that was when Jenny reached out to him again. She sent him a letter, asking him to come see her. When Forrest arrived at her apartment, he found a different Jenny, quieter, more fragile, as if life had finally caught up with her. She told him she was sick, though she didn't explain exactly what it was. Forrest didn't understand the details, but he understood one thing: Jenny needed him, and he wasn't going to leave her. Then she told him something that changed his life forever. "Forrest, you have a son," she said. A little boy, named Forrest Jr., stood in front of him, looking up with bright, intelligent eyes. Forrest's heart swelled with a feeling he had never known before. "Is he smart, Jenny?" Forrest asked, his voice trembling. Jenny smiled. "Yes, he's very smart." Forrest had never questioned who he was or what he lacked, but at that moment, he felt something new, a fear that his son might struggle the way he had. But Jenny reassured him, and for the first time, Forrest understood that he had something greater than himself to live for. Jenny didn't have much time left. She and Forrest finally married, and for a short while, they were a family. They spent their days together in Greenbow, raising their son, making the most of the time they had. Forrest took care of Jenny the way he had always wanted to, loving her unconditionally, without expecting anything in return. But the sickness took her anyway. Forrest buried Jenny beneath the tree where they had played as children. He visited her every day, sitting beside her, talking to her as if she could still hear him. He told her about their son, about the things they did together, about how much he missed her. Losing Jenny was the hardest thing Forrest had ever faced, but he didn't let the grief consume him. He had a son to raise, and he would do everything he could to give him a good life. Forrest had loved and lost, but he had also been given something precious, a part of Jenny that would live on in their child. And as he sat on the porch, watching little Forrest Jr. climb onto the school bus, he knew that life, no matter how unpredictable, always found a way to keep moving forward. Chapter 6: Reflection and Legacy. Forrest Gump had lived a life filled with moments he never could have imagined. He had run across football fields, survived a war, met presidents, started a successful shrimp business, and lost the people he loved the most. But through it all, he had never let the world change him. He remained the same simple, kind-hearted man from Greenbow, Alabama. Now, His days were quieter. His time was no longer spent running from one adventure to the next but caring for his son, Forrest Jr. every morning. He walked with him to the school bus, just as his mother once had for him. He watched as his boy grew, smart and curious, asking questions Forrest didn't always have the answers to. But that was okay. Forrest had learned that not everything in life needed an answer. Sometimes, you just had to keep going. As he sat on the porch of his home, watching the wind rustle the trees, Forrest often thought about the people who had shaped his journey. His mother, who had given him the strength to believe in himself, even when the world didn't. Bubba, whose dream had lived on through the B1-B2 Shrimp Company. Lieutenant Dan, who had found peace despite the pain he once carried. And Jenny, the love of his life, who had given him the greatest gift of all, his son. Forrest didn't dwell on regrets. He didn't question why things had happened the way they did. He just accepted life as it came, knowing that every moment, good or bad, had led him to where he was now. People often asked him if he understood the impact he had made, but Forrest never thought of himself as special. He didn't see himself as a hero, a success, or a wise man. He was just Forrest. He had never chased after greatness or tried to change the world. He had simply done what felt right, one step at a time. And maybe that was his legacy. Not wealth, not fame, not medals or achievements, but the way he had lived, with kindness, with honesty, with an open heart. The way he had loved without conditions, helped without expecting anything in return, and moved forward no matter what life threw at him. One day, as he sat by Jenny's grave, he spoke softly, as he often did. "You died on a Saturday morning," he said. "And I had you placed under our tree. And I had that house of your daddy's bulldozed to the ground. Mama always said dying was a part of life. I sure wish it wasn't." He paused, looking up at the sky, as if waiting for an answer that never came. "Little Forrest is doing just fine," he continued. "He's so smart, Jenny. He wrote you a letter, but I can't read it. I ain't supposed to. So, I'll just leave it here for you." He placed the letter on the grave, letting the wind carry its message. As he walked back home, he realized something. Life wasn't about chasing big moments. It wasn't about being the smartest or the fastest or the richest. It was about the people you loved, the promises you kept, and the simple joys of everyday life. And so, Forrest Gump kept moving forward, not knowing what the future held, but ready to face it, one step at a time. Thanks for watching the video.